they need to create an open, transparent, and accessible environment in which to carry forward this important discussion. And speaking for myself, I can say that I'm always a little bit nervous about disability and the arts, and artists with disabilities, because the language is fraught. And if I make a mistake, please forgive me. If any of us make a mistake, we don't intend to again. We are just finding a way of using this language. So before we launch into a few words of welcome by various other people, I want to thank the people that are responsible for this event. And I'll start with one of our main funders in the Saskatchewan Arts Board. They are proud sponsors for the event. We've also had tremendous support from fundraising. In fact, they're supplying lunch for you all. And we've had a lot of support for from Visit to This and Things to Credit. We've also had support from the Mackenzie Art Gallery, the Dunlop Art Gallery, the Global Theatre, Common Wheel, Campus for All, the Faculty of Math, the Theatre Department. We've had major support and funding from IRG, which is the Regina Public Interest Research Group, and we thank them for their assistance. Without them, this event would not be possible. And finally, I would like to thank the President's Office, who were supportive of this event right from the very beginning. President was able to make it today, but we have Vice President, Associate Vice President, Dr. Regina, who is from the President's Office, and Secretary. So let us welcome Dr. Welcome everyone. As we mentioned, we are here on moving this way. Okay. I'm not going to say church, I'm in here. So I apologize.
Talk to Michele.
Okay, welcome to the University of Regina. We are on 3436 land as well as the traditional home of the and that's a very important part of our past, but it is a more important part of our future. And I think it's something we need to continue to celebrate and be cognizant of at all times. As any of you who know Dr. Diane, you know that inclusivity is an extremely important part of her research, but also her personal cause. And she sends her best wishes, and this is unfortunately not able to be here. She sent to me a quote that she often uses from Stella Young, who's an Australian comedian and disability activist, or was, unfortunately, in 2014. The quote is, "Disability doesn't make you exceptional, but questioning what you think you know about it does." And I think that's a beautiful way of beginning this conversation today. Questioning what we know about disability is so important, and it's consistent with our academic mission as a university in terms of rethinking accessibility, rethinking inclusivity beyond diversity. And that's not only in terms of what we're doing here today, but it's our facilities and physical space, our policies, our processes, and how we engage and bring people into university, making education accessible for all. And that's part of why the President is so excited about this event as well as her Campus for All initiative. I think that we need to do better, and we will continue to do better, and part of today's conversation will help us better understand how we can continue to develop meaningful opportunities for young people to achieve their academic goals and contribute to their full potential. As a society, we've not always worked to enhance inclusion, and I don't need to say that to you, but I think it's important for us to acknowledge we're doing better, but we still have far to go. We have to keep pushing, and I think that's what makes today so exciting. We have an expert in the keynote address, Michele, joining us shortly. Expertise of people like Linda Donner, in the dark. I was going to walk toward the light, so I'm sure the roundtable will do the same thing. Through the roundtable discussions we'll have with various people, and of course, performance by the students. I think
Most importantly, Matt has been one of the most tremendous leaders in us, and the theater department in particular, in really leading the way at the forefront and always making us question what we think we know about ability and disability. So I want to thank you all for being here today, for participating, for your commitment and inclusion, and for making our world a better place, not only locally, but here at the University of Regina, and for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us so that we can continue to do better and be better. So I hope you have an absolutely fabulous, productive day, and welcome on behalf of the President.
Before we go any further, I have to thank our ASL interpreter, Jewel White. I forgot to mention Jewel. Thank you very much. Jewel came in at the very last moment. We had someone else doing it. Jewel was going to join us later today anyway. The woman who was originally going to do it in work yesterday. Jewel jumped in. It's helping us. Thank you very much. Now, it's a great pleasure to invite Natasha Urkel to her spot. Natasha is going to be introducing the keynote, and I want to say just a few words about our wonderful students. We're so proud of Natasha. She's been with us now for close to 5 years, between 4 and 5 years, Natasha. I can really say that it's because of Natasha that this event, that we organized this event, and that we opened up all our classes and our stages to artists with disabilities. Natasha arrived here and we had never experienced Natasha before, and she asked us if she could participate, and we're so glad that she did. She has changed us, and we really want to thank you for being here.
A strong and profoundly committed activist. A woman set in her pursuit to destroy ignorance. Once referred to as a spiky-haired catalyst, Michele de Cottignies, with over 30 years of experience in the professional arts industry, continues to knock down the walls of social ignorance. She is the creator and founder of Stage Left Productions in Calgary, through which she has worked for artistic innovation and cultural freedom for diverse artists. She is the leading contributor to Canada's Deaf Disability and Mad Arts Domain. She is an award-winning producer, playwright, director, designer, and arts and social justice advocate. Sitting on the board of directors for the Calgary Congress of Equity and Diversity in the Arts, the Canadian Arts Presenters Association, and the Steering Committee for Equity in Theatre. She serves on the organizing committee for the annual National Association of Service Organizations with the Canada Council for the Arts. She is an arts equity educator, consultant to the Professional Association of Canadian Theatres, Opera.ca, Orchestras Canada, and Calgary Arts Development Authority. Notably, her company Stage Left is one of only 6 in the world that applies the practice and technique of the theater of the oppressed, and she has worked with the late founder Augusto Boal himself. She has broken huge boundaries for the disabled arts community in Canada and has applied successful arts practices in social work, youth criminal justice, human rights, multiculturalism, mental health, self-advocacy, and independent living. This groundbreaking woman embodies what it really means to foster diversity and implement love. She is a devoted and passionate artist who shares her passion, achieving every vision and change she deems warranted. We are delighted that she joins us now. Please allow me to introduce our keynote speaker, Michele de Cottignies.
morning, everybody. Oh, sorry, just my video is switching around. I'm just going to take me a little bit of time to get used to the video feed. Thank you for tolerating it. Thank you also for that profound introduction. I'm feeling very humble now, and I'm also feeling that I'm never going to measure up. But I'm going to do my best. Thank you very much for that introduction. It really, that phrasing around questioning what we know is really, really profound to me, because that's what I've been focused on the last 5 or 6 years of my disability arts career. It's really been on trying to gather national understanding of the disability arts domain as a whole, and how we're each the piece that we're all contributing across the country, how it's adding up to this really profound movement that we're all privileged to be an incredible part of. So what I'd like to do today, after thanking you, Kathleen, and the University of Regina and all of you for showing up today for what I believe is a historical event. It's seldom that our allies come together through academic opportunities, bringing artists together. This is an unprecedented event in the sense that you have managed to bring together a community of people that we need now, especially more than ever, to be advancing disability equity and disability justice politics throughout the disability arts domain and the broader arts ecology. So I'd just really like to congratulate you, Kathleen, your department, and the University of Regina, and all of you are here today to participate as well. What I'm hoping to do today, after I tell you a little bit about who I am and why I feel qualified to tell you this information, I'm going to talk about 5 key topics. The first one I want to just begin with is language and culture. And these are just the foundational pieces of disability arts, because what we're trying to do is challenge this idea of what we know about disability arts, not just about disability, but about disability arts. So I'm going to present a little bit of a framework there. Then I want to talk about some of the history of disability arts across Canada and also the accomplishments that we have achieved. I want to also expand on this notion of what the disability community is and who we are as a team of constituents. Then I'll move into some practices and aesthetics and some of the distinctions that we're starting to make. Then I'd like to review some of our barriers and the solutions we've been working on. And then I'm going to end with a rousing call for solidarity, which I think is completely irrelevant, or you wouldn't be in the room with us today. A couple of things I want to let you know is that I am profoundly dyslexic, so I may not make much sense. I can sort of see you, and if I'm not making sense, feel free to wave your arms at me, just to give me a reminder that I need to slow down and focus and help you understand and stay with me. And also to the interpreters, just a reminder too that I tend to start speaking really quickly, because the one thing I don't do in the arts is perform, because I get too nervous. And so as I get nervous, I'm also manic on a regular basis. I'll start getting faster and faster and faster. And my apologies to those of you who are using ASL today. Please just tell me to slow down, and I'll do my best to do so. Okay, so let me start today with just telling you a little bit about who I am. I am somebody with a profound number of disabilities. They are all invisible, and they're across the spectrum. So I am identified as a disabled person. I'm MAD identified. I'm also profoundly hard of hearing and rapidly becoming deaf. I am choosing to learn ASL rather than to go to hearing aids or surgery, because deaf culture is profoundly important to me. I was part of that generation of young people who got to grow up when deaf students were integrated into schools. So I learned ASL was one of my first languages. One of my first jobs in the theater was actually stage managing Children of a Lesser God, in which you have to learn ASL. So I'm just relearning that language and coming back into that culture. And I am very disability identified, and I very much embrace the models of disability pride and disability affirmation. In the arts, I have 30 years experience. I'm one of the most experienced disabled artists in the country. And I'm one of the few of us that's actually managed to make my living as an artist over the past 30 years. So I'm not really an educated person, and I'm not an academic by any means. But I have managed to scrape a living together in the arts ecology, and I think that's unprecedented. I spent the first 15 years of my career working with companies in Calgary like One Yellow Rabbit, ATP, Theatre Calgary, doing stage management, technical work, some directing, some producing. I also did a lot of film work. But I realized after the first 15 years of that I was experiencing so many profound inequities in the quote-unquote mainstream theater world that I just couldn't tolerate it anymore. And I was either out of the arts completely, or I was just going to dig in and try to make something happen. So I created Stage Left Productions, my company, about 15 years ago to experience a theater practice and develop a theater practice that was going to be the right one for me and the people that I was working with. So when I started the company, we were a team of 27 diverse artists, largely indigenous. All of us, the thing we had in common was disability, but we were also queer artists, indigenous artists, artists of color, a lot of women, a lot of seniors. So we were a very versed company, and that really informed our practice. And interestingly, because disability was a through line for us, we really got established as a disability arts company. So Stage Left had managed over the last 15 years to position it as a leading contributor to the disability arts domain in Canada. And how we've done that? When I say we too, I just wanted to back up a bit and mention that I'm representing the Deaf, Disability and Mad Arts Alliance of Canada today. So we, as a team of us who've been working together for the past 20 years to attend to the needs of the domain as a whole and across the country. That includes me, Cyrus Marcus Ware, Rachel Gorman, Alan Shane, who's now the Disability Arts Officer, and a whole team of people from across the country. And when I close my presentation, I'll invite you to all join us as well. Anyway, back to Stage Left. So what we've managed to contribute to disability arts was 10 disability arts festivals, an annual one. We did 10 festivals every year in Calgary from 2000 to 2010. We also did one in Edmonton. That gave me the opportunity to present more than 2,000 disabled artists from across the country, England, Australia, and the United States, in all performance disciplines and the visual arts. I just haven't done a lot of work in music because it's a deficiency of mine and it requires a whole lot of skills that I didn't have. So although we were, Balancing Acts was the name of my festival, and it was a multidisciplinary festival, but we were remiss in not presenting a lot of musicians and a lot of music work. But we did produce circus work, interdisciplinary arts, performance creation, thank you, theater, all the performance disciplines, and a lot of film and screening works as well. And so that's our presenting history, but our production history, we've created 15 original performances, largely through many arts and community collaborations with artists with intellectual disabilities, youth with autism on the spectrum. We also supported a company in Calgary called the Deaf Sign Theaters in Calgary, which was 20 years ago now, I think. It was some of the first deaf arts work in the country. We've created 30 digital films. We've developed 10 what we call site-specific participatory installations, and otherwise known as pop-up social injustice encounters, where we, for example, somebody in a wheelchair will sit in front of a set of stairs in a public building and create a public spectacle, and we force people to engage with us through invisible theater, which is a form of theater of the oppressed. We've been having a great time doing that, let me tell you. But I've also done 200 community projects and applied arts projects through our Theater of the Oppressed practice. In terms of advocacy work, I have, since starting in 2003 and 2004, I created a national network of disability arts presenters to coordinate those of us who are producing festivals. And I also created an artist network so that we could connect with each other and create this community that we needed that eventually turned into our domain. Over the past 5 years, I've focused on taking those networks and turning them into what is called a national arts service organization, which is just an association and network of people that focus more on advocacy and intervening at policy and funding levels. And we've had an incredible amount of success. All of the Canada Council policies and all of the OAC's disability arts policies were a direct response to all of our requests, our recommendations, and our research. So we're really proud to sort of take credit for getting disability arts on the national arts agenda and on the policy radar, both Canada Council and Canadian Heritage. Most recently, my focus has been on coordinating DMAC, the Deaf, Disability, Mad Arts Association of Canada, and I'm also now focusing on defining exactly what disability theatre is. So my current writing project is focusing on comparing realist drama and modern drama and these sort of psychological dramas with disability theatre and identifying specifically what the differences are, and also unpacking the ableism that seems to be inherent in some actor training systems and rehearsal processes. And ultimate goal is developing some curriculum so University of Regina can use it and integrate it into your theater programming. That's the hope, but wish us luck, and maybe we can form a partnership and work on that together. So that's a little bit about me and Stage Left. I'm going to focus now on just talking a little bit about my language, some clarifications I'd like to make that I think are really important. The first one is the fact that I'm going to say dis-arts. And I'm going to use that to represent the whole of deaf, disability, and mad arts. And partly that's because I'm so dyslexic, that's just so hard to say. It's got to be even hard to here 100 times in the next 20 minutes. But I have to apologize for choosing to use disarts, because disability culture is profoundly different than deaf culture, and it's also profoundly different from mad culture. So it's a little bit exclusionary, and I apologize in advance for making that choice. It's just for ease of communication, and I know that it's offensive to many of us. But I'll also try to switch it up a little bit, and sometimes I'll say disart, sometimes I'll try to say deaf art, sometimes I'll try to say mad arts. But when I'm using this language, I'm trying to refer to the whole. I'm also going to try to use the term impairment more than I use disability. And I've already talked about how I'm profoundly dyslexic. And for those of you who can see, I'm looking up. It's just so I can reference my own notes so I can make sense for you today. Thank you. Okay. So the foundation of disability arts is actually the culture. So I want to start a little bit by defining those cultural distinctions. So deaf culture, and this is from the Deaf Cultural Center, and any deaf members of the audience, feel free at the end of this, you can chime in and provide clarifications where and as necessary. But according to the Deaf Cultural Center in Toronto, deaf culture is a set of social beliefs, behaviors, artistic practices, literary traditions, history, values, all that are influenced by capital D or small d deafness, which uses visual and signed language as the primary means of communication, and thus offers up alternatives to what is called oral centrism. So deaf arts advocates are positioning the deaf arts community as a linguistic minority within the larger arts ecology. Mad Pride then, which is the deaf disability mad arts part of that, Mad Pride or mad arts seeks to affirm mad identities as a source of human diversity rather than a source of stigma or shame. Mad Pride seeks to develop and empower mad communities. It speaks against mental health bias and resultant discrimination. It remembers and participates in mad history, and it challenges traditional aesthetics. I have to admit to loving mad aesthetics because they are so messy, and it just works so well with all my intellectual disabilities and my mental illnesses, and it really offers an alternative process to formalized theater. And that we're starting to write down and describe these practices and make them available to the larger community, and it's actually really exciting in terms of innovation. So disability culture, it tends to focus on inverting the shame of disability into pride. Disability itself then becomes understood as a collective experience of discrimination, or what we call disability oppression, or disablement, or we hear ableism as well. Disability culture promotes the belief that our impairments are natural, beautiful, and a desirable part of human diversity. What those three separate, there's one more I wanted to mention too, is diverse cultures. One of the things, as I've been part of the National Arts Service organizations and working in that domain in the arts, is I've discovered that we are one of the most diverse artistic domains in the country. We have a huge number of Indigenous participants and contributors in our community, artists of color, queer community, seniors, a lot of women. Most of our organizations are run by women. So we're an incredibly diverse domain. And because we are an incredibly diverse domain, our work tends to be diverse, and how we approach our work also tends to be diverse. And by diverse, I mean non-Eurocentric, which is sort of non-traditional. All the things we get taught in school about how theater is supposed to be, they are representing a certain kind of a culture. And disability culture, mad culture, deaf culture, and all the diverse cultures that are represented in our domain, they tend to challenge and disrupt those cultures, which is also very exciting for us. Why that's exciting is because the foundation of disability arts is this principle called non-normalization. Our cultures are non-normalizing. They don't, disability culture, mad pride, disability culture, we really advance those out into the world through our art to try to say, we're fine. How I look, how you look, our quote unquote abnormalities, they're actually normal. So we, instead of striving to become as non-disabled as possible, as hearing as possible, as not as sane as possible, we say, you know what, this is how we are. Accept it. Make room for it and accommodate it. So the core foundation of disability arts from its inception in the 1960s has been this thing called non-normalizing culture. So in that regard, the disability arts domain is really a countercultural movement. It's diverse, and it's also more equitable because we attend to the needs of the constituents. So I'm just going to talk about some of the language definitions so that as I move forward in the presentation, some of the distinctions I'm making will make sense. So the language of impairment, and I want to stress here that these are not accurate definitions. So if any of you have access to Webster's, it's not going to match. What I'm saying is not going to match. What we're choosing to do here is make contrasting definitions so we can make clarifying distinctions that are needed, especially when it comes to developing policy or curriculum or performances. So first of all, there's the language of impairment itself. More and more we're moving toward inclusive language, but that means it's getting more and more cumbersome because we have 500,000 of us to include and represent in every case. But this is why you often see, so there's deaf with a capital D, deaf with a small d, hard of hearing, and allied community members. So for those of you deaf with a big D means identified with deaf culture, small d deaf is deaf, halfway between deaf culture and mainstream culture. Hard of hearing is like me, I'm losing my hearing and I could choose to get hearing aids and I could choose to be an aural-centric person, or I can choose to embrace deaf culture. Same thing in the MAD community. So we have MAD, we have mentally ill, we have mental health consumers, we have all this language is okay. And the different entry points into your politics, your perspective of disability will determine the language that you use. So again, what we'll see is we'll see disabled, we'll see person with a disability, an impaired person, a sick person. And so all that language is all okay. And sometimes we just see person, period. So the disability just doesn't matter. I'm just a human being, end of story. So the language of disability politics, that's when we start to see some changes here. So what we start to see is biased language. And that's why I embrace myself as a disabled person, because it helps me not feel ashamed of having a disability. And yes, there's people first language where we want to say, no, absolutely, I'm a person first. But basically, we're emulating civil rights movements from the past, and we're learning from other examples. So for example, as I might say, I'm a proud lesbian woman. I can also say I'm a proud disabled woman. People of color can say I'm proudly Black, I'm Indigenous. We also are now learning to say I'm proudly disabled, I'm proudly deaf, I'm proudly insane, I'm proudly mad. So it's the language of disability politics, which is around disability rights, which is pride and affirmation. But we also have administrative language, and that's based on your impairment. So that means I'm a person with cerebral palsy. I'm a person with obsessive bipolar disorder. I'm a person with a scientific diagnosis or a medical diagnosis. And I mentioned we have people first language, which I'm a person first, so persons with a disability. That's where that comes from. Now we've moved in, and this is historical too. It started with administrative language, then it went to people first language as we saw the independent living movement, then it moved into pride language, and now we're moving into the language of social justice. And where we see these is some contrasting cultural concepts. So we have deaf, disability, and MAD identified, and then we have mass culture identified, where on one hand, disability is diversity, on the other hand, disability is a limitation. And we have the language of access, which is what society needs to get on top of, building our ramps and providing, sensory safe spaces and all that sort of stuff. And then we also have the language of accommodation, which is how those of us who are disabled, the individual supports and adjustments that we need. And we have the language of disability politics, which is a single issue model. Disability arts is only about disability rights. And then we also have, because we have a diverse domain, this language called intersectionalism. So how do you separate out? How do I separate out my identity as a woman from my identity as a disabled woman from my identity as a disabled queer woman? And so disability arts has room for all of that. So all of these cultural concepts are part of the disability arts foundations. In an artistic context, we're looking at language of adaptation, which we see a lot in inclusion. How do you adapt the arts to make them more inclusive? From the perspective of those of us who are disability identified, adaptation means we're changing the artist to match the art form, but repurposing the arts means we're changing the art form to match the artist. And that's a huge distinction we're trying to make within the difference between traditional theater, and by traditional I don't mean in a cultural context. I don't mean Indigenous theater or Black theater. I mean traditional as in modern drama. The modern drama as in psychological drama and the Stanislavski method of actor training. So that's a core artistic distinction we're trying to make between adaptation, change the artist to the art, or repurposing, which is change the artwork to the artist. And that's the distinction between traditional theater and disability theater. Okay. So just want to make a distinction again between what disarts is and disarts is not. And this comes from a scholar. It's a quote from a scholar and a colleague of mine in the UK. His name is Colin Barnes. He's been writing about disability arts for 20 or 30 years. So he says what disability arts is It is the development of shared cultural meanings and collective expression of the experience of disability and struggle. It entails using art to expose the discrimination and prejudice that disabled people face to generate group consciousness and solidarity. So on the other hand, then, what Colin says is what disability arts is not. Disability arts is not simply about disabled people gaining access to the mainstream arts domain. It's not about simply expressing our individual experiences of living with or coming to terms with disability. In Canada, how we've defined that for ourselves then is disability arts in Canada marks a growing political power of disabled people who use art to counter cultural misrepresentation, establish disability itself or impairment itself as a valued human condition, and to shift control to disabled people. So I'm going to talk now a little bit about the history of disability arts and how we've managed to achieve all of that. So first of all, I'm really proud to say I've done 5 years of extensive research, and I am really proud to report that Canada's disability arts domain is incredibly vibrant and incredibly expansive. So first of all, there are 45 companies in collectives of artists right now that are contributing work to the disability arts domain. I have a database that's in development tracking disability artists, and right now it's 4,500 entries strong. So we have 4,500 disability artists, but I've also found a Statistics Canada research report that identified 6,500 of us. So I'm in the process now of trying to track how many artists we are, but this is huge. The other really impressive thing about the disability arts movement in Canada is it's 45 years old. It started in 1970 with David Friedman's production of Creeps, a play he wrote about the experience of people with cerebral palsy in a segregated workshop. And it was produced by Tarragon Theatre and Factory Lab in Toronto. And it was an integral rise of the aspect of, integral aspect of the rise of Canadian culture and of English-speaking Canadian theatre. So the first, one of the first real English-speaking Canadian plays in Canada was about disability culture and by a disabled playwright. That's historic, and that actually makes Canada's disability history the oldest in the world. So why I really like to stress that and celebrate that is because we're not actually an emerging domain. Disability arts is not a contemporary trend. It's been around forever. It's not a site of charity or therapy, and we certainly don't need access to the arts because we've had it now for 45 years. The other thing we've done within the professional arts domain is make an incredibly large number of artistic accomplishments. So for example, some artists have been commissioned by the Prime Minister's office. There's a tapestry by an artist named Jane Cameron who hangs in Mirabel Airport. Some of our artists have won Juno Awards. They've won National Jazz Awards, a Jessie Award, which is the Toronto Theatre Awards, Chalmers Award. Jessies are Vancouver. The Chalmers Awards are from Toronto. Then there's the Sminovich Prize for playwriting. So Lyle Victor Albert, Moondance Playwriting Award. Oh, that was me. Sorry, that's egocentric. I'll take that out. And many of us have won awards. So Persimmon Blackridge, for example, is a lesbian disabled writer. She's been nominated for a Lambda Literary Award, which is incredibly significant. So my point is we are a long-standing domain of accomplished artists who have made incredibly significant contributions to the Canadian canon, cultural and artistic canon. And we've developed over 3 periods of development. There's been 3 phases of disability arts in Canada, really quickly. From 1970 to 2000, we call that a period of disability arts production. So that's when independent artists were creating a whole heck of a lot of work in the professional arts ecology. So David Friedman was writing plays for Tarragon Theatre. Joe Colgan, for example, is a multiple award-winning jazz musician, so he was performing in the jazz community. Jane Cameron, David Friedman. But the point of all the work is that we already had access to the arts, and we had it based on the artistic integrity of our artwork. They wanted what we had to say about the human condition, so they put it on their stages. So, and that's 30 years of disability arts production, and that was a huge accomplishment for us. And then starting around 2000, from 2000 to 2010, we saw a period of disability arts presenting. And this was the rise of disability arts and culture festivals. And there was a core circuit of them over the years. I think there was one in Vancouver, which was Kickstart. It was Kickstart Festival produced by the Society for Disability Arts and Culture, which is now called Kickstart Arts. And my festival in Calgary, which is called Balancing Acts. There were 3 in Toronto. The first one, though, in the country was Mad Pride, and that was introduced in 1990 in Toronto by Ruth Stackhouse and the Friendly Bike Theatre Band. Then we had Madness in the World Arts Festival in Toronto, and also Abilities Arts Festival in Toronto, which is now Tangled Arts and Disability. So that core festival circuit allowed us to develop a national disability arts domain. As we were able to move artists across the country, we began to be able to network and consult with each other and gain access to each other as a community of peers. Out of that, I developed the Disability Arts and Cultures Presenter Network, which was the first attempt to organize us nationally, and we brought everybody together to have conversations about where we're at as a domain and where we wanted to move next. What we discovered is where we needed to move next was insisting that the Canada Council and the arts funders actually support disability arts, because we've been producing it for 45 years. So in 2010, we actually launched an activist campaign to force the Canada Council to embrace and support disability arts, because we hijacked their responses to their strategic plan. They sent an open call for feedback, and we had 60 of us. It only took 60 of us from across the country to get disability art supports on the national policy radar. But it was incredibly successful, and all of the funding you've seen since has come directly out of that campaign. Unfortunately, as disability arts and policy and disability arts funding has arisen, what we've seen, what we're calling it is, quote unquote, the institutionalization of disability arts, where that the freedom and the flexibility that we used to have is now becoming limited by definitions and boxes that they want us to check off. But I'll talk more about those barriers as we move forward. So that's the history and accomplishments of disability arts, and it's significant. And we are a significant community. 6,500 people at least are contributing to disability arts domain in Canada. So I'm going to talk about the different kind of groups that are represented within that huge community. So first of all, there are what we call disability identified career track artists. And those are artists like me, and those of you who are graduating from the theater program. Theoretically, those will be artists like you too. Those of us who are making our living purely as professional artists and purely dependent on the resources of the professional arts domain, which are fairly limited, I have to tell you. Those of us who make choices to be career track artists tend to choose to be poor for the rest of our lives. Then there are artists with impairments. Those are folks who are just working in the arts, period. Maybe not in disability arts. So for example, I'm both a disability identified artist and I'm an artist with an impairment, because sometimes I just do lighting designs for the Calgary Opera or the Banff Centre. Got nothing to do with disability theater whatsoever, but I'm trained as a lighting designer, and I love to play around with beam angles and geeky little things like that. So I sometimes, just to be creative and stay on top of those skills, I take on contracts that have nothing to do with disability arts. Then we have allied collaborators. So there's disability identified artists, then there's just artists who happen to have impairments or are doing artwork or participating in the arts ecology. Then we have allied collaborators. So our non-disabled collaborators, our funders, our families. These are anybody who's supporting disability arts who doesn't have an impairment. Then we have this huge community of what I call recreational or hobby artists. And those are people with disabilities who want to participate in the arts but have no desire whatsoever to become career track artists. Excuse me. Or to have a career in the arts. So for example, for every Monday night for 10 years, I offered a drama class for artists with intellectual disabilities, and it was just what they did on Monday nights. Monday they go to drama class, Tuesday they go bowling, Wednesday they go to friendship club, and Thursday they do whatever, and Friday and so on. So but none of these artists wanted to be professional. So that's my community arts practice. That's community inclusion. And some of it has disability arts bents to it, but that's a huge part of our domain. Are artists, people with disabilities who have the right to participate in the arts but don't want to become professional artists. Then we have this huge volume also of disability studies scholars, and also theater scholars and visual arts scholars. So scholars and researchers who have taken up disability as a topic of their education work. Sorry, I'm so not an academic, I don't know how to talk about it. So Kathleen is an example of a disability scholar who's allied to our movement and has been for a really long time now, which I have to say I appreciate Kathleen and University of Regina, because we see academics who show up for 1 or 2 years and they study us and they write about us, and then we never see any supports from them again. So good on you, Kathleen. Then we have disability service providers, and those are all of the, the CP Association of Alberta, the Deaf Cultural Center, and anybody who provides support services to those of us who have impairments. Then we have market access collaborators, and those are the companies that I've infiltrated on behalf of the disability arts domain. So that's Equity in Theater, It's a huge gender-focused, gender equity-focused organization across the country that's working to increase gender equity. So I've joined that community to remind them too that, you know, there's many women with disabilities who also need to be included and attended to in those advocacy efforts. And that's why I've also joined the board of CAPACOA. It's the Canadian Presenters Association, because I'm working with them now to try to convince them to host a disability-exclusive showcase where we bring the best of disability arts performances to every presenter in the country, and they get to handpick who they want to put on their stages. Then we have what are called equity-seeking collaborators, and those are the members of equity-seeking national arts service organizations. So the Indigenous Performing Arts Alliance, Ad Hoc Assembly. There's a group called CPAMO, which is Cultural Pluralism in the Arts out in Ontario. So any diverse organization that's advocating for equity in the arts, they've allied with us. And they're, because they don't want to just have Indigenous equity, they want equity for all. So those of us who are diverse are coming together as a coalition of diverse artists as a whole. And we're actually making quite a positive impact. Then of course we have all of our stakeholders, which is our policymakers, our funders, our family members who care for us and support us, our support networks, and all of those folks. So the disability arts domain is huge. There's a whole bunch of us in different areas of the community that are contributing in ways that are so incredibly important. But what we're missing is a way to connect all of those separate pieces into one whole. And that's why DMAC is working and work like this right now. So here are some of the pieces we've developed. I'm going to try to show you a slide now, share my screen. And these are the way in which DMAC, we've spent the last 5 years trying to identify the different practices so we can sort of agree on a framework and see where does my piece fit into the whole. So if you'll just forgive me for a second, I just have to do computer things. Share the screen. Okay, I think. Is it working? Should see a slide now. It says Canada's Disability Arts Practices. Okay. So here's the disability arts domain in this little triangle I've created with this line right down the middle, just to show you the distinction. And again, please think of this more in terms of a spectrum rather than a hard dividing line. It's not necessarily a binary. Many of us cross the divide. We float on both sides of it over here. So I do inclusive art. I also do integrated art. I also do the arts and disability. I also do identified art. This is just to make distinctions that are necessary for our funders and our allies and everybody who's working with us so we can understand the whole. So here's the distinction. We have one big domain on this side. Can you see my cursor floating around?
Yeah.
Great, thank you. We have what we call normalized arts processes. So this is just the norm. I do theater, I do realist drama, I do modern drama, I do period drama. These are just already established norms. So we have what we call inclusive art. That's when we have non-disabled artists who are giving us opportunities to participate in traditional theater or traditional dance. But this basically the division here is that it's non-disability led. So it's companies creating opportunities for those of us with impairments to experience the arts. Then down here we have this thing called the arts and disability. And that's like I talked about before. Sometimes I just work in theater, period. And my work has nothing to do with disability. And that's the arts and disability. Maybe I'm going to go in one direction or the other, but for the most part, if I'm doing lighting design for companies like the Calgary Opera, that's all I'm doing. I'm a lighting designer. I'm not a disability theater artist in that context. And there are many of us who work in all of these. So on the other side, we have this thing that we call the non-normalized foundation. It's identifying with the cultures of deafness, of disability, and of madness. So that's where we make a distinction. We're calling it integrated art. And I know that the integrated art has come to mean, the integrated dance, but that's something that was imported from the UK, and it doesn't actually transfer to Canada very well. Because in Canada, we already have this practice called integrated arts, and it means an interdisciplinary art practice. So it might mean a fusion between theater and film and dance. It might be across anyways, integrated arts is a hybrid of art forms. In the disability arts, global disability arts movement, integrated arts means mixed ability. So in Canada, we've made a distinction. Mixed ability means inclusive art. Integrated art means disability-led work that can be with a mixed company. So Propeller Dance, for example, it's a mixed company. The work that you're doing out of the University of Regina, that's integrated arts. It could be inclusive, but it really depends on who's leading the process, who's in control of the interpretation of disability and the knowledge about disability. And then we have this thing here called identified art, and that's the foundation of the disability arts movement. We want to share experiences about our lives, about our experiences as people with disabilities. We want to represent that in our art because we have things critically important to share with you about the human condition. Okay, I'm just taking my notes. Great. All right. So I'm going to flip to another slide if I know how here. that shows you some more distinctions between those two. So here's just some more detail on how that divide plays out a little bit in artistic practices. So with normalized artistic practices, the interpretation of disability, it tends to be aligned with pop culture. So just mass culture, you know, the dominant culture. But we all know that that means disability is portrayed as a tragedy. And it's a limitation that we all have to learn to overcome or somehow cope with, because it's just so awful, apparently, according to every news feed you see in the morning. So in this work, impairments, we tend to be minimized. So I'm just an actor, period, or I'm a dancer, period, and my disability doesn't get in my way. In this way, then, as I mentioned before, the impairment is adapted. So those of us, we try to change our bodies to the art form because we want to satisfy those expectations of what, you know, for example, a prima ballerina. Imagine a prima ballerina right now. How many of you imagined a really tall, thin, white woman in a tutu, in a leotard? So there are these expectations of what certain types of artists look like. And in normalized artistic aesthetics, we tend to try to adapt our bodies, our quote-unquote abnormal bodies, our abnormal minds, to these normalized portrayals of what human beings look like on stage. And let me tell you, internalized aesthetics are intense. I actually watched a really radical disability-identified artist choose to injure himself in rehearsal because he thought it looked better. So that's really, really important for us to consider as we're moving in our inclusive arts projects. Where are we adapting too far? So the process is adaptation, so it's changing the shape of the person to match the expectation of what the art form is supposed to look like. This work is always curated as inclusion, empowerment, and too often as improvement, so it's art therapy. We're creating this place so that people can function better rather than become artists or represent their cultures artistically. On this side, then, we have the non-normalized distinction is that we really align with these disculture notions of impairment as diversity. It's beauty, it's desirability, and it's a source of aesthetic innovation. So we don't minimize our disabilities, we use them to shape what our art looks like and how we position ourselves on stage and our composition and our blocking and our aesthetic intentions. So in this context, impairment is affirmed as a source of diversity, period. It doesn't need to be changed, it doesn't need to be improved, we don't need to be cured, we just need to be accepted, valued, and accommodated. So in this way, then, what we do is we adapt the art form to match our impairments in ways that disrupt those normalized ideas for aesthetics. So the process, we call that a process of accommodation versus a process of adaptation. And then we curate that as artistic innovation and as aesthetic transgression. And by transgression, I don't mean breaking the law. I just mean breaking the rules of theater. So this is why you see, for those of you who are studying theater right now, in disability arts, you tend to see a lot more epic theater, theater of alienation, theater of cruelty, symbolic theater. You tend to see a lot more of those styles of theater and those uses of theater than you do over here in the more normalized side. In inclusive art tends to be regular theater, traditional theater. We make it as accessible as possible. So that's sort of the core distinctions. You just think I have one more slide there. And this is the aesthetic terms we've given for those distinctions, because our funders need to know, our peer assessors need to know what to be investing in. So we're giving them language to define that. So in the aesthetics of absence, the disability is invisibilized, or the impairment is just gone. It just doesn't matter. In the aesthetics of innocence, impairment is minimized. And innocence means the artists aren't capable. So you'll see a lot of time visual arts with people who have intellectual disabilities. You'll see this idea of art brute. So it doesn't matter. Whatever just comes out of their body automatically is so artistically innate and organic. So that's a belief, though, that we're not capable of making informed artistic choices. So in absence, the idea is impairment doesn't matter. In innocence, the idea is that we're so disabled we can't actually make informed choices as artists. In the aesthetics of awareness, we see the impairment, the way it's treated, it's medicalized. I'm going to teach you about my disability. Here's what it's like to be dyslexic. Here's what it's like to have cancer. Here's what it's like to be in a wheelchair. So that's a medicalized perspective of disability, where what we're doing is educating people on how we live with disabilities. So then there's the aesthetics of inclusion, and that's when impairment is normalized through processes of adaptation. So I'm going to make you look as much like a quote-unquote actor as possible. On the other side, then, we have what we call the aesthetics of access. So impairment is not invisibilized, it's accommodated in every individual way imaginable. So if you need a wheelchair ramp, that's one thing, handrails, all of those physical sort of things, but that might also be multisensory, sensory stimulation, having the house lights on all the time. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry, I don't know how to silence my phone. Just gonna hide it under my desk. There we go. Oh, sorry, I might have just answered it. Just one sec, sorry about that. Sorry. Sorry, I just hung up on somebody. My apologies. Oh no. Okay, might have just been my mom. Sorry, I'm in trouble now. If it rings again, it was my mother. My apologies. Okay. Just gonna hide it so I can't hear it. Okay, so then we have the aesthetics of integration, and that's when impairment is affirmed. Look at me, my impairment is awesome, period. And then there's the aesthetics of inversion, and that's when we flip over these ideas of disability is not a tragedy, disability is innovation, disability is excitement, disability is originality, deafness is deaf culture, deaf communication, speaking through symbols instead of words is look at how great it is to be disabled. That's what we mean by inversion. We're flipping things over. This whole perspective of disability, it's called flipping the familiar, just flipping it over on its end and saying to our audiences, why don't you want to be one of us? Look how great it is to be us. And then we have the aesthetics of impairment, and that's where we take all of those ideas about how great we are and we represent them physically and emotionally and artistically and aesthetically by changing the art form itself. So from traditional forms of drama more to epic theater of alienation. And for those of you who don't know what that means, theater of alienation is a Brechtian kind of theater where it's all about breaking down that fourth wall and breaking down that idea that what you're seeing on stage is just pretend. So it's taking that liveness of it and taking it out into the audience. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing these slides and try to catch up my notes. All right. Sorry, my slides don't match now. Stop sharing. Technical difficulties are temporary. Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm going to slip back. Now you'll see me again. Thank you. I'm getting all red in the face because I'm nervous. My apologies. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about why those distinctions are necessary, because we have this, those of us know we have a lot of barriers in the arts, and the barrier that most of our funders are focusing on is access. So we have the wheelchair ramps, handrails, all the things we need in those regards. But how many of us here agree that, and we know because we live with disabilities, impairments, deafness, madness, how many of us know that the biggest barrier we're up against is negative attitudes about disability? Anybody besides me? Yeah. So it's those core attitudes, and that's why we need to get to how those attitudes play out in inclusive art, and unintentionally. These are embedded biases. We've learned them from day one. There's 2,000 years of written history proving that disability has been devalued. Plato, in Greek culture 2,000 years ago, talked about how disabled people, children that were born disabled, weren't actually human beings. So this bias has been embedded in Western human history for 2,000 years now. So I just want to say, how does that bias show up in our artwork, whether we mean it to or not? I mean, in my first disability arts plays, before I became fully disability identified, my plays were not disability identified. My work was all about how hard it is to be disabled and how you have to learn to cope. And so it takes a process. My point is, these are internalized biases and we have to unlearn them. But basically what we see in pop culture, the portrayal of people with disabilities tends to be limited to 4 choices. So we're either victims of woeful afflictions, these tragic afflictions that are known as impairments, and those tragic afflictions make us incapable. So we're tragically incapable people. But this misrepresentation of disability, that turns us into objects of pity, paternalism, and dependency. Then we have this idea of heroes, superheroes, in fact. So heroic people with impairments, we are expected to prove our humanity by spending our entire lives striving to overcome the limitations of our impairment. We call these inspirational supercrips. And the art that comes out of that is what we call inspiration porn. And this is not a portrayal of disability that values disability, because all of it is about getting over the disability rather than saying disability is fine just the way it is. So the other thing we've seen, and it goes back right to the beginning of 1929, the very first world horror film in the world was called The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and it created this misperception of people with mental illness as villains. So our mental illness or any kind of physical abnormality like Quasimodo in the Hunchback of Notre Dame, the disability suggesting evil or depravity or violence, and so we've been portrayed as violent monsters that society needs to be protected from. And that's been embedded in horror film movies since 1929. And then the one that we're up against, I mentioned this before, the biggest one is internal innocence, is that we are perpetually, especially those of us who have intellectual and developmental disabilities, the belief is that we're simply incapable of making informed choices for ourselves. We are at a 3-year-old level, so you're never going to be more than have a grade 8 knowledge. It's that sort of limitation. And so we're always perceived as not being capable of. And because we're perceived as not being capable, we're not giving the training and supports we need to make informed decisions in our private lives, our public lives, and our professional lives. So that's the barriers we're up against, attitudinal barriers, and that's how they're starting to play out. So what we see now is the art of objectification. Objectification means turning us into objects. Our disabilities become objects rather than humanity, a part of human condition. So the impairment is being treated as an object of curiosity and fascination. So non-disabled people can once again line up and gawk at us and wonder, wow, look at them. This is kind of reminiscent of the freak show days in the 1950s. We're seeing a lot of this happen right now in disability arts. Like, oh, look at this person. Look how different they are. And look at how weird that is. Then we also see this thing that we're calling the art of benevolence. And that's when we're included in the arts. This is that art therapy trope. We're included in the arts because we have to get better. The arts are going to fix us somehow. But we're not broken people. We don't need to be fixed. So we don't need opportunities to get fixed in the arts through art therapy. What we need is opportunities to create plays about our own experiences as human beings. So then what we're also seeing is this thing called the art of exoticization. And that means disabilities being dissected and explained in great detail over and over again, so our audience can understand how we cope with disability and turn our tragedies and the limitations into something we can manage really well. So why I'm stressing this is because in inclusive arts, we come into that with these biases embedded in us. And unless we become aware of the fact that these are biased perceptions of disability, we have to challenge what we know, and we have to get our audiences to challenge what they think they know about disability too. And that is the joy and the potential of disability arts, is to take this notion, these stereotypes about disability, and flip them over completely. I tell you, I did a show in 2003 called Mercy, Killing, or Murder, the Tracy Latimer story. And those of you who are aware from where you are, many of you will know this history. But it was the story of the Latimer case when he killed his disabled daughter. And it was from the perspective of disability advocates. And it was the first and only time when one of my shows had gotten a standing ovation. And it was earned. Because in the comments that we got back from all the audience was, wow, I had never thought about disability like that before. And that's the goal that I always set for every one of my shows again, is challenge what the audience thinks they know about disability. Sorry, wrong button. Okay. So how do these attitudes create barriers for us? So the first one is this what's called cultural imposition. If we take those negative attitudes about disability that exist in the world and we take them into our work, then we're creating limitations within, while we're trying to create opportunities for inclusivity and accessibility. And then we also have this thing called invisibilization, and that's happened through marginalization. So artists like me, for example, I've been at this for 30 years. I've contributed so much to disability arts, but I'm not mentioned in maybe 1% of all the papers in this country about Canadian disability arts history or Canadian disability arts practices. I know there's about 30 or 40 of us that are career track disabled artists, and I don't see our work, our history, our knowledge represented in the discourse, the dialogue, the conversations about disability arts anywhere I go across the country. That introduction I gave about how disability arts is 45 years old, everywhere I go, I get gasps, because people just don't know our history. And so my question is, when we're doing inclusive arts work, we have to ask ourselves, who are the experts? Who are the experts? Those of us who have vast contributions have shaped disability arts, or those of us who have come from outside of the disability arts domain and are going to help us now become artists? We have to remember that there's a history and there's a volume of expertise within the last 30 years of disability arts. Okay, just a couple more things around the barriers. So those barriers have turned into 3 sort of barriers across the world. Across the country. Yes, it's across the world because we have no difference between Canada or the others. But we have 3 core barriers. And the biggest one we're up against is attitudinal barriers. As a result of these attitudinal barriers, that we're less capable and therefore dependent on non-disabled people for access opportunities, what's happened is we've now up against a whole bunch of economic barriers. Because what we're seeing as a result of inclusion becoming the #1 idea about disability arts is that those people who are including us are getting funding, but those of us who are already doing disability arts work are not getting funding. So in almost every case, we've been tracking this through the Canada Council in every one of their disciplines. In almost every case where there's a proposal put forward to a jury, a peer assessment committee at the Canada Council, and one is from an artist with a disability to do a disability arts work, and one is from a non-disabled person or a non-disabled company to include disabled people, every single time the non-disabled person, artist, company is getting funding and the disabled company is not. So the Canada Council's first investment in disability arts was 3 years of what they called Capacity Development Fund. 90% of it went to people including us. Only 10% went to those of us who are already capable and have been for a long time now, been producing our own disability arts work and working with our peers. So there's nothing wrong with inclusion. No, we need this, and when I end in a couple of minutes, I'll explain more about why. But we have to think about the impacts of inclusion and how it's changed this idea of those people are making investments and making policy. What do they know about disability? They know that we're dependent. So of course they're going to fund people that create opportunities for us. So if we can shift that attitude saying, hey, we're capable. We want to collaborate with non-disabled people. I do it all the time, but we need to get invested in ourselves. And then, of course, there's the architectural barriers. So attitudinal barriers are resulting in economic barriers. And then we have these architectural barriers, which is a lack of access. I think there are 2 fully accessible arts venues in this entire country. And that is just not okay. One thing I'm happy to tell you, though, is I had a meeting with the Minister of Disability last October, and she committed to making sure that every one of the cultural space investment projects, because Canada Council is investing in renovating arts venues, every single one that gets funded has to commit to creating accessible venues. So we're working on those barriers. And the other thing that's really, really important to remember is that even though we don't have accessible arts venues, we still have 45 years history. So access is not getting in our way. It's not making it easier for us, but it's not stopping our work. And we're never going to let it stop ever. So some of the solutions that DMAC is proposing is to prioritize equity within inclusion and within disability arts. So that's why the title of my presentation is From Inclusion to Equity, because inclusion is along a spectrum. Inclusion is incredibly important, but the foundation of it has to be disability equity. So we have a request to everybody is that as you're doing disability arts work, please make your #1 priority disability equity within disability art and especially within disability theater. And how do you do that? You move from inclusion to integration to autonomy. So from empowerment to counterculturalism to the affirmation model of disability. Then we also integrate disability justice politics, and that's from disability rights, which is that single issue model, to diversity, to what's called intersectionalism. And that's for example, indigenous constructs of mental health, or a Black perspective on disablement, processes of global disablement. So that's where we can bring all of our diverse collaborators, can bring in all aspects of who they are, rather than just have to focus on this single issue of disability, because we can't separate out who we are as human beings when we have complex identities. The other thing is to make disability culture, not pop culture. Disability culture, the foundation, by disability again, I mean deaf culture, and I mean mad culture, mad pride. Make that the foundation of all of the work you do. How is your work representing our culture, rather than just including our bodies or our minds or our hearts? And then within disability arts, we want everybody to move from these traditional established forms of art to repurposed ones that embrace our impairments as aesthetic innovations. And in conclusion, really quickly, I just want to say that we are way ahead of the game. In 1998, Pamela Walker, a scholar and a disability artist, she defined 3 goals for disability arts. Most countries are still on goal #1, which is to recognize disabled people as professional artists. We did that from 1970 to 2000, when we achieved a whole heck of a lot of artistic accomplishments through our independent artistic production. The second phase then was to develop work in-house. And by in-house, that means within our own community. That's why we created all these festivals in this national circuit of disability arts and this national disability arts domain, because then we could support each other. And I don't know how many times in my disability arts festivals there would be 50 of us hanging out in my living room, because it was the only time we had to get together with those 4 days that I managed to bring everybody to Calgary all at once. And we would map out plans, and we would hold each other up, and we would develop new artistic practices like queer crip and other really exciting, innovative things. But we couldn't do that without access to each other. So we needed that community and that national conduit of connection we had through the festivals, which we've now lost because of funding cuts. And that's a huge problem we're having and that DMAC is trying to fill. But the third and most important goal, and only we are there as a country so far, is to take our movement, our artistic movement, and the messages and the things we want to say to Canadian audiences, to take it from the disability arts domain out into the broader sphere, in the broader arts sector, in the broader community. Because what we have to share about the human condition is profound. It's unique and it's utterly original. And that's where we need to be together. We need to be collaborating. We need inclusive arts, and we need an integrated arts. We need disabled leaders, and we need allied market access collaborators. So, and as you're moving forward through your rest of your symposium today, I just want to end with that introductory phrasing from the president, which is about let's use our disability art to challenge not just what we know about disability, but to challenge our audiences about what they think they know about disability art. It's a huge potential. It's what DMAC's focusing on now, emphasizing art. We're going to try to host a gathering of disability advocates coming up soon. It's our April 30th application to the Canada Council to bring a bunch of us together to start fighting more and more for the advancement of disability, deaf, and mad cultures in the arts. And so here's my invitation to each and one of you. You're all welcome to join us, to join DMAC, to get behind us. We're going to create an artist database. We're going to create online catalogs, toolkits, presenting guides, curriculum for schools. And because our agenda is so huge and it's so for so many people, we need all of your support, all of your contributions, all of your knowledge, your expertise, your passion, and your humanity. So thank you all very much for letting me yak at you for a half an hour now. If we can do questions and answers. I can't hear very well, so I might need, but if there's any questions, comments, or clarifications, I can be on. If we're on schedule, Kathleen, I can stay for a few more minutes and we can do that. Alternately, I've given Kathleen a copy of the presentation. I'll clean it up actually and send you a better one, Kathleen. But you're all welcome to grab hold of that and we can host a conference call and I can answer any questions you want at another time as well. Thank you. Congratulations.
So I can't thank you enough for that. That was a very dense and impassioned body of information, and you made us all sit up and take notice and listen really hard because you are a very quick speaker. So we were listening as hard as we could, and I think we were right with you the whole way. So thank you very, very much. We have maybe time for one question. Our day is absolutely packed as we move through it. Our next event starts in 10 minutes and we have to take a bathroom break, so I'm not sure we're going to have time for more than one or two questions, but does anyone have a comment or a question for Michele? Anything new? Yes, Catherine. I'm curious, what is a fully accessible art venue?
Sorry, I can't hear it all.
What is a fully accessible art venue?
It's what?
A fully accessible art venue.
So a fully accessible art venue I define as an equitable arts venue. So it accommodates every form of diversity imaginable. So it's what we call inclusive design. So a fully accessible art venue attends to the physical barriers that are experienced by people with physical disabilities. Might also include a multi-sensory room. Could have a separate private space in it that has a quiet space for people like me who get overstimulated in crowds. I can go into a quiet room. We do see some theaters that have pieces of this. So Pump House Theater in Calgary, for example, has a crying room for babies that many people with autism use. We go and hide in there when we can't cope with the stressors of being in a crowd. But it's also the culture, though. So apart from satisfying the actual needed accommodations from every type of diverse person, might be alternative languages. If you need to be ASL, but you might need to be French, for example. I mean, in Western Canada, in Calgary especially, we don't deal with francophones very much, but they're also a part of the equity-seeking arts community. But primarily also too, an accessible arts venue means it's welcoming and it values our diversities. So instead of treating us as a burden that they have to figure out how to deal with in order to create access, it's a welcoming environment. Say, come on in, and the door's not just open, but it's adjusted and it's adapted because we want you to be here. We want you to be part of our community. So for me, an accessible arts venue is one that understands the value of those of us who have disabilities and why it's valuable to create opportunities for us to come to them and share who we are with them.
Well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to cut it off there just because we have to move on to the next event. So, if you join me one more time.
Thank you so much. Have a really great day, everybody. Okay. I'm going to shut this off now. Thank you. Have a great day, everybody.
And we have about 10 minutes before we move into our first panel. And our first panel is actually back in RC 1